this gospel reading that we have from Mark being our earliest set of written down information about the early church. Mark is really addressing several concerns in the community in the passage that we just heard that all revolve around this idea of when is Jesus going to come back again. They have the stories from the earliest and the apostles about how Jesus, after he died, they had experiences of Jesus in the closed room when he comes to the apostles. They had experiences of him on a road that they share and talk about. And then they have this experience of his ascension. And the promise in the first community is, well, he's coming back. He's just gone for a while. And so the whole community begins to discuss, well, what's it going to take for him to come back? Because he doesn't seem to be coming back right away. And they've been told by some of their teachers that they'll experience Jesus coming back in their lifetime. But then they start to die, and Jesus hasn't returned. So they're trying to figure out, okay, so when is he coming back? Because we have this promise that he'll be back in these generations. What does it mean? And will those who have died before he came back, will they be part of his coming back? Because he promised that he would not die before he did. And then as time continues to go on, and they're not seeing him, and things are actually getting worse in this persecution, and it's not looking good, and they have all kinds of pressures to stop what they're doing. The theology is revised further to a broader understanding. Well, we have to be part of making a world in which he will come back. And we invited him back. Now, as generations of the church have continued, and different theologies have emerged around us, we pretty much fall to a place of exactly what Mark said to this community. We don't know. We don't know. And that's part of our faith journey, that we don't know. We have lots of ideas about that, hopes about that. We'd like to see it in our lifetime. Maybe it won't happen until later. If it does happen much, much later, maybe we'll participate in that in a way we don't understand. And what is the nature of his return? And this idea that Mark puts out there, which is, it's not enough to just kind of wait around in this antechamber of earth, waiting for him to come back. That we have things to do. And he uses that servant language. And Jesus raises us up in the parable of like the fellow who goes off on a journey. And others are there to kind of keep things in wet. And we don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know exactly how Jesus appears, especially when last week what we heard was, what you do to the least of these, you do to me. So he's here in the people we see around us day to day. That Jesus is present now. He is, after all, as Advent teaches, Emmanuel. The name means the God with us. The God that is with us is the God that we are asked to see in the here and now, and respond to in the here and the now. When I was very little, I think I was about 6 years old, and my family lived in San Bernardino, California, of all places. So you can find out, 1969, Charles Manson is up in the foothills of San Bernardino, before we even knew what was going on. And the life is very different. We have lots of civil rights issues that have been going on throughout the 60s. We have people doing important things, Selma, all throughout the South, all throughout the North. Different areas of our nation are challenging the status quo. And I was all of 6. And I really didn't have any sense of all of that very important life going on around me. But I was going to a school in San Bernardino and meeting quite a diversity of of people that I had not had a chance to ever meet before in my life. We've been living in a little suburb of Clinton Heights, Ohio, until then. And I was entranced by this diversity. We had various Hispanic peoples. We had Native American people, so that was fun. We had African Americans, all kinds of folks. And I got a mad crush on a little African American boy called Demetrius Jones. Demetrius Jones. So if you're watching this video, Demetrius, and you lived in San Bernardino, I pestered this poor, beautiful little boy within an inch of himself, and I cornered him on the playground at one recess, and I made him marry me. Because gosh, golly, I knew what I wanted, right? And bless him, he did. He was all smiles about that. He went home, and he pulled his hair out, and then every night for the next several weeks after that, he would call me right around dinner time, and we'd have this little 5-minute conversation. And my parents were sitting there ready to sit down for dinner, and they're like, "Hurry up, hurry up." And we're just like, "Oh, that's so nice." Even his older brother was very jealous of little Demetrius, I grew up at the age of 6. Well, it wasn't so many more years later that I understood that it was really kind of remarkable that this was no big deal at all to my parents. They thought it was cute. And they let me talk on the phone with him at dinner time. Not until many years later did I understand that my parents were so cool. Years later, I was about 13, and I had to go into a hospital for a series of tests. And as related to my heart, I was actually born with a little funky heart valve. And I still have that, still funky. But I went in for a series of tests for the first time. And I had this African-American nurse who kind of setting everything up on me, getting me ready to go. After the test was all done, I was getting dressed, and she hurriedly came out into where my mother was waiting, and she said, "You've done something very special with how you've raised your kids," because she actually talked to me like a person. And when my mother told me that with great pride later on in the car as we were driving home, my thought was, how sad that this nurse who has given her life to helping people is not having an experience on a daily basis of being regarded and valued as a person. Now, as years have gone by in my life and having more and more encounters and awareness around issues of racism, and then serving on our diocesan committee for anti-racism, and learning from our national trainers about how even within the church, these issues are very real. A few years ago, when I was taking a general ordination exam, for example, one of the questions on that exam had to do with, where do you think the church is with its anti-racism efforts? Apparently they got slammed pretty darn hard. And the people who are the evaluators for that, and I was frankly one of those who was really challenging the institution back because of trying to weave together my own Native American heritage and spirituality with where the church was and its expectations. I was predominantly a European-centric spirituality, including the symbol systems of prayer. So I was one of those people challenging that. And now, today, we have Ferguson, right? You've been hearing a lot about that. And I know that there are some people who feel we've heard enough about that, and they want to move on. Even in Seattle just a few days ago, as we had the tree lighting ceremony, right? There were people who were gathered out straight of literally the marketplace, wanting their voices heard. It is kind of a pattern that after some crisis happens, there's a little while before we go back to status quo. And the voices are really not wanting to let this one go and go back to a status quo. There is a challenge for us to see today how much more work we have yet to do. Advent is about a time of waiting, right? It's waiting for God to come. Waiting for justice. Waiting for greater peace among warring nations. waiting for greater equality and awareness, waiting for living wages, waiting for equality of food and economic distribution in a global network of interdependency, waiting. And what I hear in the voices of Ferguson is a call that says that they are tired of waiting for the coming of these things. And they're asking for our awareness. Quite literally, we're all being challenged to open our eyes, to be awake to how the Christ within each person around us is longing for deeper connection. I recently went to the movies with my husband on a movie date. We don't get to do that a lot. I think it happens twice a year. And we went to see the movie Interstellar. Has anyone seen that? A couple people in the choir in here. Thank you. Interstellar was really interesting for us because as we were sitting there getting our minds around the storyline of this guy who's an astronaut who has the charge of going out and finding a new planet because the Earth is dying. And he realizes that it's going to involve journey back in time because of being in the proximity of a black hole. And time goes much more slowly than what's happening back on Earth. And he's left a daughter back on Earth. So she's growing up and growing old while he's relatively the same age. And as science fiction would provide, there is a way in which he finds to try to communicate with her through time and space. Now what Nigel and I became aware of as the movie was going on is we got a little annoyed with how loud the soundtrack was. And we're trying to focus on the story because it's a cool story, we're getting into it, we like the acting going on, but the soundtrack was blasting us out of our seat at certain times. And we got so annoyed enough that when the movie was done, even though we liked it, we're kind of walking out going, we got to tell the manager that the volume is too high. So we found a manager, we said, that was almost painful how loud that was at times. It's too high. And the manager said, actually, the director has done that on purpose. And we're like, why? Well, he wrote an article about it, but it was the director's choice. So Nigel and I left still feeling kind of annoyed, but we were talking about it on the way home, saying, why would a director choose to do something so annoying? And as we're thinking about it, I realized, the times when it was really the most loud are the times when he's making those efforts to communicate with his daughter across time and space. And you can barely hear the dialogue. We had to strain through the painfulness of the soundtrack to hear them communicate and to hear what he was trying to get across. And isn't that true for Ferguson and for things that are most important in our connections with others? That through the violence of war, through screaming and hurt voices, through violence perpetrated against one another, we have to hear and pay even more close, concerted, focused attention to hear what's really behind all of that noise, what's being communicated, and all of that, all of this distraction. A couple of days ago, Portland held its own rallies of awareness around the issues of racism associated with Ferguson and power dominance control issues in society and the militarization of our police that challenges how we used to know officer-friendly street corner. And in that protest, there was a 12-year-old African-American boy that was holding a sign that said, "Free hugs." Free hugs. And there was one of the officers sort of keeping peace, if you will, or trying to be present to whatever was going to happen. He was there. And he's in his garb of helmets and any attack gear. Right? Doesn't look terribly friendly at that point, but trying to be prepared. And this officer called the boy over to him and they started talking about what was going on in the protest. And then the officer asked the boy about his school and how things were going there, and they were talking. And at the end of their conversation, the officer said, "So, can I have one of those free hugs?" And the boy just cried. And he gave him that hug. And there's this beautiful picture that you can find on the internet of that moment. Here, through all the noise, and you see and hear people longing for deeper, more authentic connection to one another. The noise is ultimately about that connection. The more noise there is, the more that's missing. And we have to hear very hard, listen hard through all of it to hear that. Advent is a time of waiting. But as St. Mark has told us, it's not just sitting around looking at your clock, wondering if he's going to come in your lifetime. We're being asked to do things with our time. We are being asked to be present to one another in the way that our Advent prayer around wreath said about prophets. We are asked to be part of a transformation, the recognition that the kingdom of heaven is within us, longing to be born. Advent is about things waiting to be born. Any mother will tell you you're not just sitting around waiting for that to happen. You're engaged in that process and very intentionally trying to be aware and nurtured in that process. So in this Advent, I invite you to listen more deeply to your life, to the lives around you. Don't get distracted by the noise, and listen for the voice of God.